Good day and welcome to the first episode of my podcast with the title Understanding John Stuart Mill. I'm your host, Dr. Lawrence Holgate, retired professor and former department chair at California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo, California. The title of this podcast, Understanding John Stuart Mill, is also the title of one of the 8 study guides that I've written during the years of my retirement. The guides are designed to help beginning students read and understand the classics of philosophy. Each guide in the series is about a different classic book. We began with Plato's Dialogues from the 4th century BC, and we will end with David Hume's 19th century Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, which Hume wrote some 2,400 years later. And by the way, all of the guides are on sale at Amazon.com, the world's largest bookstore, as you may have heard. You can use the search terms Understanding Mill and my last name, Holgate, Houlgate. I'm emphasizing the U because people forget and spell it HOL. It's Houlgate. So if you use those words, you may be able to, I guarantee, I've just tested it, that you'll come up with my book and the explanations that Amazon gives you as to how to get them. In this podcast, I'm going to start with a discussion of John Stuart Mill's book, Utilitarianism, published in 1861, 2 years after his more famous book, On Liberty, published in 1859. Now, why start with the later book? Why not start with On Liberty? Well, the reason is that studying the later book, Utilitarianism, is going to prepare you with some understanding of the principle of utility before we see that principle applied to answer the central questions in the earlier book On Liberty. Utility first, liberty later, as I tell my students. We're going to be publishing each episode on Mondays at 5 p.m. Pacific Time. Well, that being said, let's start with a short biography of John Stuart Mill. In the paperback and in the ebook editions, it has the title About John Stuart Mill. That is, if you are lucky enough to have purchased the book, you are reading along with me. About John Stuart Mill, and it begins with a short quote from Mill's autobiography. And here's what he wrote. I have no remembrance of the time when I began to learn Greek. I have been told it was when I was 3 years old. And so began John Stuart Mill's education, believe it or not. He was tutored entirely at home by his father, who took advantage of his son's extraordinary intelligence to train him to become next in line to carry the flag for radical legal and social change in England. John was born on 20 May 1806 in northeast London. He was the eldest of 6 children. His father was James Mill, a Scotsman who had been educated at Edinburgh University. James had moved to London in 1802, where he was to become a friend and a prominent ally of Jeremy Bentham and the philosophical radicals, who were urging extreme changes in the social order. It's been said that the education of John was motivated by the desire of his father, encouraged and supported by Bentham, now John's godfather, to equip young John not only for leadership of the next generation of radicalism, but to guarantee that Bentham's groundbreaking work in philosophy, in economics, and political theory would survive long after his death. And to this end, James's education of his son was a huge success. The writings of John Stuart Mill, including the books Utilitarianism and On Liberty, have had a strong influence on ethics and political philosophy and are now considered essential reading, not only for philosophy and political science students, but for anyone who wants to study philosophical classics and to accept the challenge to think critically about moral principles and individual liberty. James Mill recognized soon after John's birth that he and his wife, Elizabeth Barrow was her name, That they had produced a genius, despite his own work doing his rigorous research while writing the 7-volume book, A History of British India, James immediately set himself to homeschooling young John. After John learned Greek, now remember he started Greek at age 3, and he studied mathematics between the ages of 4 and 9, John read on a daily basis books of history, beginning with the histories of ancient Greece, Rome, Scotland, and England. John would take long walks with his father in the early morning before breakfast. He would give his father an account of the books he had read the day before, referring to notes that he had made on slips of paper while reading. And here's what MacLeod says about this period of John Stuart Mill's life. John had absorbed most of the classical canon by the age of 12, along with algebra, Euclid, and the major Scottish and English historians. In his early teenage years, he studied political economy, logic, and calculus, utilizing his spare time to digest treatises on experimental science as an amusement. And at age 15, upon returning from a year-long trip to France, a nation that he would eventually call home, he started work on the major treatises of philosophy, psychology, and government. That's the end of the quote from MacLeod. At age 17, instead of going to university, either Oxford or Cambridge, where he would certainly have been a great success, John's occupation and status was set for the next 35 years by his father. His father had obtained for him an appointment from the East India Company in the office of the Examiner of India Correspondence. John's first job was to serve as a junior clerk to his father, who years earlier had received the same position on the basis of his authorship, A History of British India. John dove into his work while at the same time continuing his studies at home, tutoring his brothers and sisters, taking on the responsibility of editing Bentham's newest book, and publicly propagandizing for the radical political agenda. Well, all of this took its toll. At age 20, John lapsed into a deep depression. His education had prepared him for writing about and promoting the creed of the philosophical radicals, but it had not prepared him for life. Here's what he says in his autobiography. It occurred to me to put the question directly to myself. Suppose that all your objects in life were realized, that all the changes in institutions and opinions which you are looking forward to could be completely effected at this very instant. Would this be a great joy and happiness to you? And an irrepressible self-consciousness distinctly answered, no. I seemed to have nothing left to live for. These were the thoughts which mingled with the dry, heavy dejection of the melancholy winter of 1826 to 27. And during this time I was not incapable of my usual occupations. I went on with them mechanically, by the mere force of habit. I had been so drilled in a certain sort of mental exercise that I could still carry it on when all the spirit had gone out of it. A friend told me how he and others had looked upon me as a made or a manufactured man, having had a certain impress of opinion stamped on me which I could only reproduce. That's the end of the quote from his autobiography. Well, Mill's depression continued for 3 years. These episodes were to recur throughout his life. His first recovery from what he called the malaise began with an accidental reading of Marenthel's memoirs. And here's what he says. I came to the passage which relates Marenthel's father's death, the distressed position of the family, and the sudden inspiration by which he, then a mere boy, felt and made them feel that he would be everything to him, would supply the place of all that they had lost. A vivid conception of the scene and its feelings came over me, and I was moved to tears. From this moment my burden became lighter. The oppression of the thought that all feeling was dead within me was gone. I was no longer hopeless. I was not a stock of stone. I had still, it would seem, some of the material out of which all worth of character and all capacity for happiness are made. That's the end of the quote from the autobiography. The poetry and writings of Coleridge, Carlyle, and Goethe opened the door to romantic thought and an acute awareness that the Enlightenment philosophy with which he had been brought up only contained one side of the truth. He later recounted in On Liberty, his most famous book, that no one should ever claim certainty for any philosophical theory, school, or position, including the utilitarian creed that he had been promoting for several years. Mill set as a personal goal to reconcile Romanticism and utilitarianism. Quote, whoever could master the premises and combine the methods of both would possess the entire English philosophy of their age, end quote. A few years after his emotional restoration, Mill met Harriet Taylor at a dinner party in 1830, and the two quickly fell in love. Well, unfortunately for both, Harriet had 4 years prior married John Taylor, an amiable, though intellectually unadventurous, pharmacist. In fact, Taylor was so amiable that he responded to the couple's mutual desire to be with each other with a generous offer to disappear on occasion and leave the two alone. For several years, Mill visited Harriet at the Taylor's country retreat when Harriet's husband was not present, and he visited her at their London residence while he visited his club. Although Mill and Harriet insisted that their relationship was entirely platonic, not everyone agreed. Mill says, our relation to each other at that time was one of strong affection and confidential intimacy only. For though we did not consider the ordinances of society binding on a subject so entirely personal, we did feel bound that our conduct should be such as in no degree to bring discredit on her husband, nor therefore on herself. End quote. During these years of platonic courtship, Mill wrote the book titled A System of Logic. That was in 1843. He wrote The Principles of Political Economy, published in 1848, and he published weekly opinion pieces for the London newspapers. He was also an editor and a frequent contributor to the London and Westminster Review, a quarterly journal founded and funded by Jeremy Bentham in 1823. Harriet's husband died in 1849. 2 years later, Harriet and Mill married. Quote, though not before the perceived scandal had caused a rift between Mill and many of his friends, Mill felt firsthand the stifling effect of Victorian judgmentalism and oppressive norms of propriety, a subject which he would later take up On Liberty. Harriet was an enthusiastic participant in Mill's writings during the next several years. Mill credits her with making major corrections and revisions of the first drafts of what became Mill's central ideas. He says this, On Liberty was more directly and literally our joint production than anything else which bears my name, for there was not a sentence of it that was not several times gone through by both of us together, turned over in many ways, and carefully weeded of any faults, either in thought or expression, that we detected in it. It is in consequence of this that, although it never underwent her final revision, it far surpasses, as a mere specimen of composition, anything which has proceeded from me, either before or since. With regard to the thoughts, it is difficult to identify any particular part or element as being more hers than all the rest. The whole mode of thinking of which the book was the expression was emphatically hers. End quote. Harriet died in 1858. Only 7½ years after their marriage, while Mill and she were traveling through France. Harriet was buried in Avignon. Mill was devastated. He purchased a house in Avignon, close to the cemetery, where he would live out most of the rest of his life. He inscribed on her grave this epitaph: She was the only earthly delight of those who had happiness to belong to her. Were there but a few hearts and intellects like hers, this earth would already become the hoped-for heaven. Harriet's death, in fact, came only a little over a month after Mill's retirement from the East India Company, for which he had worked for almost 35 years. At the time of his retirement, Mill had risen through the ranks, eventually holding his father's former position of Chief Examiner of Correspondence. That's a position roughly equivalent to Undersecretary of State, involving managing dispatches for colonial administration. After Harriet's death, and probably at her urging before she died, Mill continued writing. After publishing On Liberty, the year after her death, Utilitarianism appeared in Fraser's Magazine in 3 installments in 1861, and in the same year he published Considerations on Representative Government. 4 years later, Mill wrote an examination of Sir William Hamilton's philosophy, and at the urging and help of his stepdaughter, Helen Taylor, Mill wrote On the Subjection of Women. Published in 1869, it was one of the first and most influential books promoting the legal and social equality of women. Mill's autobiography was published in the year after his death. The year of his death. In 1865, Mill was urged by the Liberal Party to stand for membership in the British Parliament as a representative of Westminster District, and here's how he responded, campaigned and won the seat. Just listen to this. He says, I wrote, in reply to the offer, a letter for publication saying that I had no personal wish to be a member of Parliament, that I thought a candidate ought neither to canvass nor to incur any expense, and that I could not consent to either. I said further that if elected, I could not undertake to give any of my time and labor to their local interests. With respect to general politics, I made known to them, among other things, my conviction that women were entitled to representation in Parliament on the same terms with men. It was the first time, doubtless, that such a doctrine had ever been mentioned to English electors, and the fact that I was elected after proposing it gave the start to the movement, which has since become so vigorous in favor of women's suffrage. I strictly adhered to my plan, neither spending money nor canvassing, nor did I take any personal part in the election until about a week preceding the day of nomination, when I attended a few public meetings to state my principles and give to any questions which their own guidance. Answers as plain and unreserved as my address. Mill had spent most of his time during the period preceding his return to England at his home in Avignon. He says, answers as plain and unreserved as my address. Well, while in the House of Commons, Mill did exactly what he had promised. He championed the unpopular causes of extension of suffrage to women, for Irish reform, and for the prosecution of Governor Eyre, E-Y-R-E, for atrocities committed during his administration in Jamaica. As a result of his strong support for the prosecution of the governor, he frequently received abusive letters. Quote, they graduated from coarse jokes, verbal and pictorial, up to threats of assassination, end quote. Well, Mill did not win a second term, being defeated in 1868. He retired to his home in Avignon, and he died there on 7 May 1873 at the age of 67, and was buried next to his beloved wife, Harriet. And so ends the short biography of John Stuart Mill. In next Monday's reading, we will take on Utilitarianism itself, the great book, and we're going to start with some general remarks that he makes at the beginning of Utilitarianism. If you have the book, and I wish you would get it, the actual book, you can get it in almost any bookshop, and you can get it on Amazon. Utilitarianism by John Stuart Mill. I always urge my students to read that before they read my interpretive book, which I'm reading from today. So we'll see you on next Monday, or you'll hear me on next Monday. Thank you very much, and good day.